Huggy Rao is the Atul McBean Professor of Organizational Behavior and Human Resources, Graduate School of Business, and Professor by courtesy of Sociology at Stanford University. His most recent book, co-authored with Bob Sutton, is Scaling Up Excellence, which is a Wall Street Journal bestseller and was included in the best business books to read in 2014 by Financial Times, Inc. Magazine, Amazon, Forbes, Washington Post, and the Library Journal. Just basically everywhere. His research has been published in numerous scientific journals, and he has served as the editor of Administrative Science Quarterly and has been a member of the editorial boards of American Journal of Sociology and Organization Science and Academy of Management Review. Now, you guys have heard me introduce Huggy before. I could go on and on with all the numbers and the acronyms behind his name, but he's just a really awesome person and guy, and I'm so glad that you're here with us today, Huggy. It's always a pleasure. And with that,
thank you so very much, Robin, for that gracious and very. Thank you so much for your gracious and generous introduction, Robin. I'm so glad you teed up Scaling Up Excellence. I should add that my wonderful co-author, collaborator, and John's and mine's collective friend, Bob Sutton, he's also on the webinar as a listener, so he tells me. Today, we're very, very fortunate to have John Lilly visit us. How do I describe John Lilly? Put simply, John is, one of the most interesting people I've really met in the Valley. John is a computer science undergrad and a master's in computer science from Stanford University, then founded his own company, Reactivity, was the CEO who led Mozilla, particularly the introduction and implementation of Firefox. Subsequently, after that, he served as a partner in Greylock Ventures for several years, and today he advises CEOs and the like. But most of all, I'm personally very grateful to John because John actually sets aside some time to teach a class on building company culture from startup to scale up at the Stanford Business School, along with another compadre, Sujay Jaswal. The three of us come to class, and what we do is we challenge students, and we all disagree, and the students have a lot of fun. But the amazing thing about John is, John, on the one hand, is very attentive to research and at the same time, very, very informed about ground level realities. So he is able to marry both clean models and dirty hands. We're very thankful to you, John. Welcome.
Thanks, Huggy. It's good to see you.
Thank you. So to our listeners, we're very grateful to all of you for having set aside time. As Robin telegraphed, I want to make this a conversation. And the way we'll make it a conversation is I'll tee up a few questions with John. And then after that, I'd very much encourage you to use the chat option to write out your questions. And then we'll actually, respond to those questions as well. Just so that all of you are emphatically clear, both John and I treat questions as gifts, not as interruptions. So please use the chat option. The more questions, the better, and we'll respond to them, as soon as Robin triages them for us in meaningful chunks. Wonderful. So, John, let's actually begin our conversation. What is company culture? You've been a VC, you've been a CEO. When you walk into a startup, how do you sense its culture? What things telegraph you that this is culture?
Sure. Yeah, I think culture is misunderstood. I think most people, it's a pretty squishy term. I think most people don't totally understand what it means. I think of it in two different ways. I think of it, one of the definitions I think about it is it's the way you make decisions, especially when the leaders or the founders aren't in the room. So it's the way that things really happen in an organization. That's one of the things. Another way I say it sometimes is that it's the company values realized or operationalized. So it's the values in action. And that actually leads you to this other thing, which is that it tends to be this reinforcing cycle. So you'll tend to have values that are intentional and or there are some degree of intentional, those will affect how you build the cultural norms in your company. And those cultural norms will either reinforce the values or undermine the values. It's just kind of this virtuous or vicious cycle. But it's a lot around intentionality. And so, I think a lot of people like to say, like, if you build your culture or it builds you at some level. So that's the way I think about it. It's like how you do things, how you make decisions. And that's the reality of your values.
I love the way you've just described it. You build culture, culture builds you. Can you just expand on that just a little bit, please? What does building culture mean, John? And how does culture build you or me if we are members of the same organization?
Sure. Yeah. Like everyone will tell you they don't like politics in organizations, for example. And so you might have a value that, well, we're a politic-free organization, which is basically an oxymoron. There's no politics-free organizations. But to the degree that you believe in transparency and that kind of stuff, that you might say you believe in there's no politics, but then to the degree that you let politics enter into decision-making, you'll see that start to grow because people are quite smart about how things actually happen and how to get things done. And then that will tend to erode the belief that what you say your values are actually your values. And so it's just one simple example, but the way you do things will tend to either reinforce what you say you are or undermine it. And everyone is, I think, smart enough to see that.
Everyone is smart enough to see that. So often, not just in the Valley, but everywhere, people talk about culture eats strategy for breakfast. What do people mean by that? What's your take? And if I'm a founder, when do I think of culture? After deciding my strategy? After deciding the beta version of my product? When do I begin to think of culture?
Yeah, this is another motto that I think takes some explaining, because I think that it's a little bit people rely on it too much, and they say, well, this is why we have a super nice culture or super kind culture. And I think what you're really saying is that what I take away from when you say culture eats strategy for breakfast is, if you build the right kind of company that tends to grow the right kind of people and leaders in all levels, whether it's just leaders at the leaf level or leaders in the management level, then you will tend to get reinforcing and strong action in the right ways. Now, but that means each of them will be able to operate against the strategy. But you can't have culture without a strategy. You can't have strategy without a culture. You need both things to operate in concert. But what you're really trying to figure out is, like, how do I create an organization that can operate against the strategy itself and create strategy at good time? So if I can create an organization with leadership who understands why we're doing what we're doing and can make changes and can change strategy and tactics over time, obviously that's better than having one single source of strategy all the time. And so you're really talking about culture to develop people and leaders and decision-making capabilities that's what they can execute a strategy.
That's executing strategy. Now, allow me to please take you to Mozilla. You're the new CEO there. You've just taken over the company. How did you go about addressing the issue of culture and strategy when you took over at Mozilla, for example?
Well, I didn't take over at Mozilla. I joined Mozilla. So Mozilla had this long history of being a startup, like an open source project that had been going for a long time, for 8 years or something like that by the time I joined. And they had just launched Firefox and just started to be successful. And I joined in a role that wasn't a particular leadership role. I was on the executive team, but I didn't have much of a team. I wasn't the CEO. And in fact, when I joined, like, there were a lot of things that I said that were wrong and really provoked a lot of antibodies. I started saying things that didn't quite match the ethos or the mission or the culture of the place. And very quickly, people explained to me why that was, apostate and horrible that I could think that stuff. It's like, holy smokes, like, who is this guy? He's a suit. And so I had to figure out how to number one, understand the organization, understand the cultural norms. Some of it was written and a lot of it wasn't, like any organization. But a lot of it's just like, you have to walk around and talk to people and understand why they're there and what they're doing. And over time, as I started to invest in my understanding of the culture and invest in my contributions to the culture, then I got enough of, a so-called bank account of credibility so that I could start to say, well, I think that if we could be stronger if we did this or that. And I eventually became the CEO. But that was kind of an outgrowth of leadership. It was a consequence more than it was a trigger, to be honest with you. So by the time that I became CEO, Mitchell and I had been running the organization together for quite some time. But when I got there, it was about 12 employees, and we quickly grew to maybe 50 that first year in 2005 when Firefox was growing. And by the time I left, it was about 400 or 500 employees. But the Mozilla always understood its mission. And understanding your mission is a huge step towards understanding how to build culture, because you've got mission and you've got operating principles and values about how you go attack the mission. And then once you start to, if you can understand mission super clearly, and Mozilla's mission is just to make sure that the internet is strong and belongs to everyone, not just big companies. And then you say, oh, well, that mission implies these values, which are people have to understand what we're doing. So there needs to be transparency. People should be able to contribute no matter where they live in the world. That means we must be multicultural and multilingual. So there's all these values. And then once you understand these values, that very, very clearly starts to say, well, if it has to be multilingual, multicultural, multi-time zone, that means we have to have video that's available for all hands all the time. And this was in 2005, and that was a little bit hard to do. Now you can obviously do it. It meant that we had to have clear systems for how you interact in multiple languages, for example. Meant that for board meeting, because we believed in transparency as a value, because only with information can you participate. When you had board meetings, I would spend time and go through the board deck for hours for anybody who wanted to understand it and wanted to see it. And so I think that understanding mission and mission leads to values, values leads to cultural and the specifics of the mechanics. And then there's just day-to-day stuff. So, I think I've told you before, as we grew, people, like any organization, people start to feel alienated from the organization and alienated from leadership as you start to get levels in between individuals and leadership. And so, one of the things I did when we moved to a new office, a new, bigger, kind of a little bit alienating office, I stuck my desk. I had my stand-up desk that I kind of stuck in the middle of a hallway, so that as people walked in, I was standing up and working, and you couldn't help but make eye contact with me. And if you make eye contact with somebody, you're pretty likely to say hi, because it's awkward if you don't. And so suddenly now everybody's talking to the CEO in ways that maybe you wouldn't if the CEO was off in a corner in the office. And so just little things that. That was a value of openness and transparency and connection, and any question's okay. Little things like that tend to reinforce the values all the way up to your value stack, and then all the way up to mission after that.
Lovely example. Now let me take you to your VC incarnation at Greylock. I'm sure you must have listened to lots of pitches from entrepreneurial teams. And as you listen to them, you sort of size up, does their strategy make sense? But I imagine you paid attention to their culture too. So how did you address pitches where the strategy was great, but the culture was, if you will, somewhat suspect? What did you guys do? What did you personally do? Did you choose not to invest, or?
I made a lot of mistakes I made a lot of decisions that would have passed up good investments for companies that I thought were culturally problematic. And sometimes that means that the values of the company don't align with values that I care about. Sometimes it means that the founder doesn't totally understand how to build connection and culture in their company. But I would say that I think it's very very, very hard to understand any culture from the outside. I think full stop. Now, I think it's hard. It's a different kind of hard to understand it from the inside. But I think that just like understanding, it's impossible to understand anybody else's relationship fully. I think that for investors on the outside, you can understand what the founder is like. And you can, in Molly Graham, who, articulated a bunch of Facebook's early culture, for example, and then Quips after that. She likes to say that 80% of your culture comes from your founders, from the things that they care about and the things that they do, and partly it's because they're such strong carriers of culture and such strong role models, and partly it's because they just set up all the mechanisms and all the routines, and so just a lot of it comes from the founder. And so as an investor, what I think it was very hard. I mean, you have to understand that as soon as you go in and look at a company, quote, look at a company, to visit an office back when we could visit offices, to assume that you can understand anything about what's really happening by observing what's happening in physical space is, I think, a little ridiculous. And so all you can really do is understand. You can talk to founders, understand why they made the decisions they made, how they think about decisions that are in the future, and just spend a lot of time with them thinking about that. And then you can sometimes understand the way that other people on their team talk about that stuff and think about that stuff, and the way that they think about hiring other members of the team. But I think that believing you understand the culture because as you invest, I think it's quite hard.
Wonderful. Wonderful. As I of course, have a number of questions to ask of you, but the participants in our webinar too are, sharing a number of questions. I thought I'd channel a couple of them. So let me begin with the very first one. How do you manage a situation, asks one of our viewers, when, there is actually a big change, a situation or a crisis where the startup couldn't be scaled due to an unforeseen event like COVID?
Yeah.
So you have a crisis.
There's not a lot of unseen events like COVID. COVID is a little bit one of a kind. Let me answer this question in two ways. So basically, it's like, what do you do when something happens that's unforeseen, like COVID? And so I would say there's two categories of things. There are things that are like unforeseen things that are kind of workable, and there's unforeseen things that are a little bit like global pandemic, which is, I think, a completely unprecedented thing, like for at least in our work style. Let me take the unprecedented stuff first, and we'll come back to the more normal unforeseen things. What I would say with COVID is we are all figuring it out together as we go. And I'm on the boards of 8 companies, I guess. And I talk to the leaders of these companies, at least every week about how they're doing it. And they're all dealing with COVID differently. The companies that had gotten to some scale and some momentum before COVID, I think, are doing the best. The companies that were kind of wandering around trying to figure out how to find customers and how to find right product market fit, that's the most dangerous. So at some level, the companies that are earliest are the ones that are going off and building product. They don't really need to talk to anybody. Like, being remote is fine. The companies that are at scale and have had customer momentum already are doing fine. And it's the ones that are in the middle that are looking for product market fit that are in the really most challenging position. But everybody's situation is different. And what I'm learning from the CEOs that I interact with every day as we talk through this stuff. Figma, for example, where I'm on the board, Dylan, the CEO, said, well, what he realized is that their management team was talking a lot about when should we go back to the office. And so they spent a lot of time on management teams like, well, should we go back? Should we tell people we're going to go back at the end of the year or next year? Or when should we say that? And what they realized is that they didn't really have the right language to talk about this because it's not clear that there's a back to go to. And what became clear to Dylan is that everybody was grieving the loss of what we had before. And there were all sorts of different assumptions about what next would look like. And so they just did a survey. They said, let's ask people how they're feeling, what they're thinking about, what they would do given choices. And let's not assume that there's going back to what it was like ever. Let's think about what we want it to be like in the future, and construct it going that direction. So let's get data. Let's think about back to our values. What do we care about? How do we build it? And then let's think about what makes sense in the future. And so they were open about it. And they said, well, here's what we got. Here's what we're thinking about. We'll give you clarity. And one of the other things became clear is that the people that needed the most clarity around COVID, for example, were parents, because parents have kids in school. And school in the United States is very uncertain right now. Like, my 8-year-old is in the room next door. And so he'll burst in here at any moment during our podcast, but we'll see. But every parent is going through that stuff. And so, Figma said, well, we'll give you clarity. You don't have to come back to the office until June. After that, here are what we're hearing about the culture we want to build, and we're going to construct between now and then. We'll construct what the new reality is like.
The new reality.
I'm hearing the same types of things from Code for America, where I'm on the board. It's a nonprofit. What I'm also finding is that in a unexpected situation like this, it's lasting for so long. It's taken some people a little while to settle into the understanding this is going to be, a year. And so it takes people a little while to internalize that this is the situation over time. And I think that most companies have gone through this mania where they said, man, this is incredible. It's working great. Like, how great is Zoom? And there's no commute. And then you start to realize all the things that you lost and need to reinvest in around connection and building up a company, that kind of thing. This is kind of a long-winded way of saying everybody's sorting this out together. I think there are no models. And I do really value companies like Stripe and Coinbase and Figma that are doing this in the open, and even Google lately, who said, this is our plan. It's subject to change, but here's why we're doing it, so that we can have this discussion and talk about it. And I think the best companies will bring employees in together.
So here's a wonderful question from one of our viewers. Is culture face-to-face? Can you build culture when work is remote? And if so, how do you do that? Do you have any stories, any examples, is the question.
Yeah, I think that, so I don't think culture is face-to-face. I think that we build cultures in any way humans can communicate. We build culture. What I think is harder is that the percentage of the ways that things get done that people can't see is much higher when you're having a remote culture, potentially much higher when you have a remote culture than when you don't. So if you're in the office and you see leadership make decisions and they go have meetings, they write on whiteboards, they have all hands, whatever, you can see a lot of the things that they might not be formal decision making. And so when you've got remote cultures, the most aggressive ones, like Gumroad, for example, run by Sahil Lavingia, they write down everything. And so their move to remote, like, they have more culture that's explicit than most companies that are in person. So they don't rely on the in-person as a crutch. And so as a result, like, COVID and remote has been fine for them. What I've found is that that moving to Zoom calls, and so I think a lot of people now are, your wall-to-wall Zoom, and it's a little bit more transactional than your typical office environment. And so your office environment, you'd go in and you waste a lot of time. You'd have lunch with people, or you'd chat with them in the kitchen, or you'd have a lot of downtime where you maybe talked about things that weren't, maybe quote important enough to talk about it in a meeting. And I think that with Zoom calls, you tend to say, well, the purpose of the meeting is X. Let's talk about X. Once we're finished with X, let's all get off the call. And so you're not doing these serendipitous interactions, and so you tend to be a little more focused on your particular group and your particular project, and the connectivity with other groups outside the serendipitous connectivities is diminishing. And so what I hear all the companies I'm interacting with is they're all looking for, how do we build spaces and time to recapture some of that serendipitous investment. And that's, I think, going to be the key. So I would say that the companies that are working best are the ones that invested in culture and helping people understand culture before we move to this remote world. And we've kind of been drawing down on that bank account since shelter in place started, and that you have to reinvest in it. Now, there's other cultures that have, like I said, with Gumroad, for example, or WordPress, that's been run remotely by Matt Mullenweg forever, that have done really well in this way. And they've built these patterns and routines for how to connect. In Mozilla, we were hybrid the whole time. We had an office in Mountain View. We had offices around the world. And so we coped by just having a lot of people on synchronous communication, IRC and Slack. We had a lot of people on calls all the time. And then we just made sure that everybody understood that they could travel to see people face to face anytime they wanted, which obviously is not the situation it is today. But you find ways to invest.
That's actually very helpful. In the meantime, our mischievous colleague Bob Sutton has come up with a question. And the question is, how do you know when your culture is being violated, and what do you do?
Yeah. Well, violated, that's an interesting word. So to the extent that you can build, I mean, think back to the value stack. So think back to mission, values, operating principles, and how they should align. And so what you're trying to do is create situations where whether or not a founder or leader is in the room, everybody kind of knows what the right thing to do is. And so when you talk about culture violations, that will tend to be, oh, well, that person made a decision it wasn't data-based, or that person made a decision that wasn't in the interest of customers, or that person made a decision and didn't tell anybody, so they weren't transparent enough. And if you built your culture, and if you've communicated the way things happen in the right ways, if you've built that and reinforced it enough and told that story enough, then everybody will say, well, that's not the way we do things here. And when you say that's not the way we do things here, sometimes that means you're making me uncomfortable. And so you need to kind of disentangle discomfort from genuine violation. But that's okay. And then I think that what I always tried to do is model behavior in front of other people around what to do when something doesn't feel like it's aligned culturally. So I think I've talked to you before about, at Mozilla, as we started growing, we had 40 or 50 people in the organization. We started having layers of management. I started having meetings with not just my direct reports, but their reports. And so what I was looking for was, I was always very honest with my vice presidents. When they said something, I said, well, that doesn't sound right, or that sounds problematic, or let's fix that. And I wanted other people to see me interact with VPs in ways that was specific and corrective, but not judgmental. And so you're trying to find ways to model that behavior so that everybody else can say, well, that doesn't sound right to me. Let's get to the root of it without being personalized, for example.
That's very helpful. There are a number of other questions that are being asked as well, John. One sort of question is, when does culture become a hindrance, and how do you know that?
Yeah, well, I think culture's always cuts both ways. I think that for startups mostly, and really mean is challenger companies. For challenger companies have to be spiky in ways that incumbents don't. So incumbents, they derive their strength from their huge distribution and from their the way that they do things is sort of the status quo. And challengers, like Netflix was a while ago, might be online only versus Blockbuster. Challengers need to be defined and specific and spiky. And so most cultures say, and so, Netflix was famous a long time for saying, look, here's our culture. And they try to say, they put it in a deck. They said, here's the way we operate. And if you're here and you don't think that describes you, like, take a layoff package and we'll pay you to quit. And definitely don't apply here if this doesn't sound like you. And so they were trying to figure out how to help people self-select in or self-select out, because they felt like the culture made them distinctively shaped to compete in the market. Now, once you get big, so I think your culture can pull you off any time. Like if your culture is not aligned with your strategic goals, your culture is not aligned with your tactics, you can kind of last for a little bit with that misalignment, but you can't last forever. And so I think especially as you start to get big, you start to try to do more things, you start to hire more types of people, it tends to be harder to maintain the spikiness of your culture. But I think that you also just have to understand fitness for purpose. And like I said, it's always best to say, here's our mission, here are the goals we're trying to do now, here are how the values attach to the goals, and trying to reinforce which cultural norms make sense at any given time.
It's very helpful. In the meantime, just a quick note to our participants and listeners in this webinar, please continue to keep the flow of questions. It's a gift to us. We very much value it. So one other question from the list given by colleagues there, and that is, what are the 3 traits required to build a culture, the 3 traits required to scale a culture? Is there a difference?
That's interesting. 3 traits. Well, the first thing is I just think intentionality. So being able to articulate what you're trying to do. Like I said, if you don't build it intentionally, it'll tend to build you, and so you'll tend to be reactive, not active. So the first thing is understanding what you're doing and being intentional about it. The second thing is I think you have to be and I guess the second too, I think you have to be very disciplined about communication. So, Molly, we talked about Molly Graham earlier, who started to define the company culture at Facebook in the early days after being at Google. And she just wanted to talk about what's the story? Like, what does hack mean? Facebook's talked about move fast and break things, which I think has since been a little bit villainized. But at the time, when they were a startup, it meant do whatever it takes to keep the service running. And then over time, that started changing and morphing into like, well, try things, but don't kill the service for our users, that kind of thing. So I think that being disciplined, being communicative, and I think that for me, it's not so much talking about things in culture, but it's saying, here's how we make decisions. We make decisions based on data, or we make decisions based on what customers want, or we make decisions based on what employees have been noodling on and what the market says. And so just being clear and being disciplined and always being willing to go back and say, well, here's why we're doing the thing we're doing.
So which brings me to another question that was also listed in some way or shape, and that is, when you actually make culture explicit, should you emphasize the good things, what is sacred, or should you emphasize the things people should never do, the stuff that is taboo? Which one's kind of more important?
Yeah. For me, maybe it's because I'm an engineer, I've always found it easier and more natural to say, well, that's the stuff we don't do. Let's fix those. Let's fix problems, because I'm an engineer by background. I think it's often more. I think it gives you more value to highlight the things that are sacred and things that are excellent about culture. It will tend to reinforce good behaviors as opposed to. I think that you need to reinforce good behaviors more than you need to say that's a bad behavior. I think people will tend to over-rotate on things that are bad and under-notice praise. And so what I had to learn over time is to say that's a really good example of how we do things the right way, as opposed, the CEO calling out a behavior that wasn't good for a customer, wasn't good for an employee. You do that once, everybody in the world notices it. Saying, way to go, great job with the customer, people will tend to dismiss that. And so I think you have to do that probably 10 times or 100 times for every time you say, well, this is problematic. But I do think there are cultures that don't say this is problematic enough, and then it gets out of control very quickly to the extent that you don't correct.
Right. So one related question, it's a big meaty topic, and that is, one of our viewers says, hey, in this environment, diversity and inclusion have become salient. What do you recommend that a company do to improve its track record on the diversity front, especially when it has enabled discrimination in the past? That's the question.
Yeah, well, we have a lot of work to do. Obviously, it's hugely important. Every company that I'm interacting with cares about it. Like everything else, I think the first thing you want to be able to articulate as a company is why you care. So I think that being able to say, we care about diversity because, or we care about inclusion because, and then finishing that sentence is huge. So sometimes people say, well, because it's the right thing to do. And I think that's 100% valid and fair. Other people say, we care about diversity and inclusion because it helps us serve our customers better. because it reflects our customer base better, because it makes me happier to go to work here, because it makes stronger products, because it makes stronger employee base. But I think that being able to think through both why you think it makes you better and what aspirationally you're doing it for, that will give you a framework for how to think about it and talk about it over time. I think without the because, I think you're just trying to get a thing that I think it will be hard to figure out the ways to do it authentically. As for how to fix diversity, like in inclusion, one of the companies I work with, I mentioned, called Quip, where Brett Taylor, who's now the president at Salesforce, started, and Molly worked for. They were about 50% women on the engineering team. And you say, well, how did you do that? And what they said is, well, we hired half women. It wasn't that hard. We just did it. And so there's something about complaining and wringing your hands about diversity so hard and pipeline so hard. And there's something else that said, well, we're not going to do it unless we can hire diversity. Now, hiring diversity is only the first part. You've got to make sure that you build support and structures for them to have voice. And if you might have one type of diversity, but not other types of diversity, but this all works back to, like, why are you doing it and what's the main goal? So, and so I think that you have to just be continually looking for what bias exists in an organization. Where is there unintentional bias? Where is there invisible bias? How do we surface it? How do we create structures for people to have voices who have not had voices historically? And that's, I think, constant. We'll make progress on racial diversity or gender diversity, and we need to make progress elsewhere. And so it's a constant. I think it ends up being a value of the company, and you, like the other values, you'll say, well, this is a value, and then the way you operate and the way you work will either reinforce or not.
Mm-hmm. Again, that's very helpful. One question is, do you have a taxonomy of cultures in mind? Are there different types of cultures? And if so, what's the taxonomy you lean on is the question.
That is an interesting and complicated question. I mean, the companies that we all know the best, the companies that are giants around here now, you think about Apple or Google. And if you are around Silicon Valley long enough, you'll tend to have a shorthand for, oh, that person's kind of Amazon-y, or that person's kind of Apple-y, or that person's kind of Google-y, or Mozilla-y. I don't think I have a taxonomy, except to say that, Google is very collegial in nature. They tend to have very open culture. They tend to say, here's the information, go look at it, make your own decisions, be smart. Apple tends to kind of break everything you read in management, and you learn at the GSB, and they tend to say, we're very siloed. We're not going to have a lot of mobility between jobs. You're going to just go do your job and not ask a lot of questions, not try to do anything outside of your job. And so they tend to be very siloed, very information securing, that kind of thing. You've got older cultures like Microsoft that tend to be a little bit more traditional in the way that they think about roles. And then more modern cultures like Stripe, who tends to be very, very engineering based, or, eBay, who's very product management based. But these things, they all kind of start from the seed of their founders, and then they kind of grow over time, and they kind of develop certain ways of doing, certain ways of being. And I don't think I have a really good taxonomy, except for organizations that tend to, maybe the best taxonomy would be one that you and Bob have talked about in your books, which is like, how do you scale in a Buddhist way, or do you scale in a Catholic way? Yeah. So you talk about how do you grow, and in Catholicism, obviously, the analogy is that Catholic organizations, they are like the Catholic Church, which is the source of truth is the Pope in Rome, and everything comes from that. And Apple is clearly the most Catholic of organizations in the world. It certainly was under Steve Jobs. With Tim, it's a little less Catholic. But Buddhist scaling would be, let's teach people how to think. Let's make sure they understand our operating principles, and then let's let them go out and work. And Google tends to be a little bit more Buddhist in that way. And so, that's a reasonable taxonomy for me. That's how I would think about it as I was looking for a place to join. I like Buddhist organizations more than I like Catholic organizations, even though at $2 trillion. Apple's a pretty good example of a Catholic organization, a pretty good Catholic organization.
Yeah. So there are a number of other questions that are being asked as well. John, I'm going to sort of select and cull them. One interesting question is, when there is a crisis, when there is pressure, how do you calm employees down?
Sure. So sometimes you don't want them to calm down. Sometimes you want them to realize there's a crisis. I think, but often you want them to be in their rational headspace and think about what to do. And almost always that has to do with, if you're intentional about, I hate to reiterate, but if you're intentional about mission, values, operating principles, you can just go back and say, yes, this is a problem because it's misaligns with our values, or because it's misaligns with our operating principles, or because it misaligns with mission. You can start to articulate where the gap is and say, so once we know where the gap is, we can say, well, we should fix it because there's a gap, or we should change our values because the reality is more correct than what we thought our values were, our articulated values were, or this is wrong and it doesn't match. And so we're gonna change the way we behave so that it comes back into alignment with our values. So I think that the more that you have been explicit and intentional about these things over time, the easier it is to calm things down. The part where you get in trouble is when you have not been explicit about these things and you haven't shared these things, and something happens, and then suddenly you need to explain what to do, and you don't have a history of blogging. So I think about there were some venture firms that got pulled into things that sort of, she said, Me Too type stuff, maybe 10 years ago. And I remember one of the partners had a blog post like, here's why it's totally not true and we were doing the right thing. And if you look back, it was the first time he had blogged in 10 years. And so there was just no credibility and no framework to understand how he was thinking and why this wasn't just being defensive. Whereas if he had been sharing all along, you'd have said, oh, this lines up with all the other things that he said all along, and here's why this kind of follows as a consequence. But as a one-off, it was not particularly credible.
Lovely. So there are a number of questions, again, that are coming up. We're very grateful. It's 10:42. I'm also keeping track of time because my boss, Robin, today will tell me, hey, we're getting close to 11. I want to make sure I'm mindful. At this stage, I thought it would be interesting for all in the webinar or conversation to listen to a young Stanford student. This young Stanford student wanted to be a scientist first, and now after coming to Stanford wants to be an entrepreneur. She's an amazing young woman. I want to welcome Olivia Hallisey. Olivia, welcome. Please join us. And I know that you have a couple of questions.
Thank you so much.
Welcome to the conversation, Olivia. So why don't you fire away a couple of questions? You're thinking of becoming an entrepreneur, am I right?
Yes. I would love to become an entrepreneur one day. And it's been such a privilege to listen to you both today. And I was thinking about becoming an entrepreneur, I think a lot about how to establish culture and then preserve that culture as you scale. So I wanted to know what are some key constructs and processes that engender and safeguard equity within an organization, and then how do you intentionally strengthen these as a founder or a manager within an organization?
Yeah, your question is, so thanks, Olivia. The question is about how do you safeguard equity? Is that the core of your question?
Yes.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. So I think that the first thing you have to do is you have to model. So you have to model patience. You have to model that when questions arise, when comments arise, that you value the line of questioning and thoughts from the questioner themselves. So I think that one of the things that founders and leaders often forget is that the world doesn't. A lot of founders and leaders forget that most people don't see all the things that are happening and can't see the whole board. And so they often get annoyed. It's like, well, why don't you understand this is what we're doing? Or why do you have that point of view? Or it's like, why can't you just like it's really obvious. And so it has to come from a place of understanding that your point of view is not, you can't see the same things that everybody else can see. And so, and then the second thing I guess would say is you have to the degree that you can, you have to not react in ways that are ever seem very frustrated with people. And so I really struggle with this, especially the first time I was a CEO, that when I was always working on the next set of problems. And when people ask me, like, why did you do this thing in a dumb way, CEO, I could get short. And a lot of founders are like this because they're always trying to think about the next thing. And so if I was short, that shut people down for, sometimes forever. Sometimes they would never, ever turn back on because the CEO was short with them. And so I started learning how to just be patient, how to let people finish the question, how to ask more questions about why they were asking, and then to share this, as much information as I could. And when I made mistakes, I still make mistakes about being short, and from time to time, always to go back to them and say, and try to address it as quickly as you can, and say, hey, tell me more about what you want to understand. Tell me more about how you want to engage, and I'll share whatever I can with you. And so I got some of that right and some of that wrong, but I think you always have to model patience, model listening, model engagement. At Figma, where Dylan Field is the CEO, their values were, create, celebrate diversity, create inclusion, have fun. And they start every talk with those same, every presentation to the company, they start by putting up the same values every time. And it seems like a gimmick for a little while, but then you play forward to where, that 2/3 of the people at Figma weren't here a year ago. And you start to see, it's like, oh, that's what we say that, but it's not just a slogan. Here's how it gets reflected by the Q&A period is at least as long as the meeting itself was. So you start to realize all the ways that it reinforces. But it's like all this stuff is just continuous. You just have to keep working at it.
Mm-hmm. And in addition, just building off of what you just said, I think what I found from my very limited work experience, that culture can sometimes be different at different levels within an organization. And I think what separates work experiences is when a culture is uniform and strong at every level in an organization. And so I was wondering, from your perspective, what levers you have found, or efforts you can perform and enforce within an organization to ensure that a culture is uniform and strong and upheld by every employee in an organization?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I think that the first part is like just remembering that that's true, and that somebody coming out of college will perceive the culture in a way that's completely different than a vice president who's in their 40s. But a second thing I think for leadership in particular would be to be curious about people, and so we don't talk about Hewlett Packard very much anymore, but they used to talk about MBWA, which was management by walking around. And so those guys, even as HP was growing, and HP used to be an incredible company, like much different than it is today. It used to be like the smartest, most technical, like the Google of 50 years ago maybe. And you'd be working on something at your workbench, and then suddenly one of the founders would come just sit down and say, "Hey, tell me what you're working on." And because they were just nerds, they were curious, they wanted to know. But partly it's like what they're communicating is that the work that individuals are doing, that's the work of the company, not the management of the company per se. And so partly it's just like you look for ways to blow up the divisions at every level and to mix people up. And I think that's actually one of the real challenges of this remote culture we're building, is that you got to find ways to intermix. I think it's really easy just to interact with people on your team or at the same level. And so we got to find ways to have cross-cutting conversations as much as we can. But I think that's a really good one. I think the other thing is like I would pretty routinely talk to people about, who are 3 years out of school and a staff engineer, and they said, well, I want to be a vice president of engineering. And we would pretty routinely talk about, okay, let's talk about what I expect out of vice presidents of engineering, that this is the set of things that I expect them to be able to demonstrate. And let's talk about what you can demonstrate now, and let's see if we can be explicit about the gap. And so if you can be explicit about the gap, then you can start to climb up in that way. And so it's having conversations that are real and specific, but don't feel overly judgmental with anybody at any level, I think is part of the key too.
I'm keeping track of time. We have another 8 minutes, and there are a couple more questions. So if you don't mind, Olivia, I'm going to interleave one of them. And this is a very personal question, John. This is again from Bob. And Bob asks, what did you learn about culture as a CEO? What did you learn about culture as a venture capital, a partner and investor? And is there a difference? And if so, what?
Yeah. Well, by and large, I mean, cultures are defined by the people who are there, not by the people who are investors. And so VCs, I think, you're along for the ride a little bit, and you can affect the way that people ask questions, and you can affect the way that leaders lead a little bit, but like your effect on the culture, I think, is somewhat minimal. This other question from Bob, like what the other half of his question, the statement after his question was that he was there and I was pretty impatient, which is true. Yeah. I mean, what I learned about in my first gig was just my first CEO job is that I was in a big rush to do things all the time. And the more that I acted like that, the less able I was to lead. And so the more that I was able to create what I really wanted is other people to be in a rush and pull me rather than me to be in a rush and pull them. And so what I wanted to build is urgency and alignment more than I wanted to say, come on, let's go. And so, I mean, that's it mostly. I learned in my second CEO job, I was more patient. I think I listened more, and I was looking to create more leaders, and and lead less myself, I think is the way I would say it.
Wonderful. Olivia, you have the floor. Do you have another question for John?
Yes. Thank you so much. Selfishly, I think we all would love to learn about how in your career, if you think any efforts that you did particularly stand out as being especially effective in shifting a culture in a new direction? Because I think we've spoken a lot about how to establish a culture, but is there a way to really, move a culture into a new, more positive place and allowing it to develop?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is I don't have that much experience of moving cultures. I think that once you have values and cultures in a certain direction, it's hard to move them. Culture tends to be sticky in a way that marketing messages are sticky. They tend to be ingrained values and ways of doing things. I do think that very often people pay attention to who you promote and who you hire. And so I think that very visible celebrations of people in that way are huge. I think that to the degree that you, so I think that's part of it. So I think that who you hire, who you promote, who you talk about, who you value, who you amplify, that's about the best you can do. I think that people just listening to you talk about, this is the important thing to do culturally, this is why we are who we are, it doesn't have as much impact by a long stretch as people saying, oh, I believe that this is the way we are because this person, I believe in this person because these people are all lined up.
Wonderful.
It's a pretty squishy answer. I'm sorry.
No, but nonetheless. So using reward systems is a very powerful lever in a sense to change culture. Changing jobs is another way to change culture. Now, I'm very mindful of time, so I want to sort of close on one big issue, John, and this is that when people compare, the arc, of course, is to go from startup to scale. When you're a startup, you're a small team with big people. But when you're a scale up, the danger is you become a large company with a lot of small people. How do you, as the CEO, how do you, as the founder, what do you do to culture to offset that? It's a cousin of Olivia's question, as well as a number of questions on our list.
Yeah, again, I would, to bring us all the way back to the beginning, I'd say, like, understand what kind of culture you are and understand why you're doing the things you're doing. So I think that inside Google, for example, they've created as many leadership jobs as possible. So, obviously Sundar is the CEO of Alphabet, but he was CEO of Google before that. And then working for him is Susan Wojcicki, who's the CEO of YouTube. And there's a CEO of Waymo and a CEO of Google X. And so there are these leadership positions where people have the ability to run the organizations that they have responsibility for. By contrast, like Apple would be say, look, here you're in the marketing silo, or you're in the engineering silo, or you're in the services silo, and your job is to be as you own everything across the whole company in this particular way. But it's all about, how do you create ownership? How do you create agency? How do you create as much space for people to make decisions and make mistakes on their own, and accountability? And so, I'd say that's the start and the finish. You have mission, goals, values, and enough space for leaders to be genuine leaders and not just work for somebody else, but work with you.
Right. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I'm very mindful we're getting to the close of our webinar. Yeah, I'm just going to make one or two closing observations. I just want to express my gratitude to John for taking the time to share his reflections and his wisdom. And I want to express my deep appreciation to all of our listeners for so generously giving us the questions. As you can see, we combined the questions. Some of them were also asked by Olivia as well. Thank you, Olivia, for doing that. As you walk away from this webinar, you might want to keep in mind a couple of things, I think, and that is, and I think John put this beautifully, which is, you build culture, culture builds you. So in other words, if you're going to go from startup to scale up, make sure your culture scales your people too, makes them bigger than they are. And this is the message that John was actually offering. The other sort of important takeaway for all of you is, and I really like the emphasis that John placed on the way we do things and actions. And indeed, in the course that John, Sujay, and I teach on Startup to Scale Up, we sort of emphasize this in detail, where we talk about caring, sharing, and daring being the muscles that are necessary to propel you from startup to scale up. On a personal note, I want to steal a line from my wonderful colleague, friend, and collaborator, Bob Sutton. And that is, Bob always says, as a leader, the most important thing is when you meet somebody, they should walk away with positive energy. And that's absolutely true. That is the single biggest predictor of whether you're able to engage people and mobilize people. If you drain energy from other people, it's not going to do very much. To that, I'd tack on one more thing, and this is something John's kind of been emphasizing, and that is, great leaders also ask helpful questions. So if you really want to measure yourself as a builder of culture, when you lead a meeting, when you bring a team together, ask yourself, how many helpful questions did I ask other people? Because I want to turn as many lights on in the house, versus how many statements I made, either of my opinion or my experience. Meaning statements like, in my experience, in my opinion. And once you track that measure, that's actually going to give you a very good insight into you and indeed the company. So look at that metric. Number of helpful questions divided by the number of statements of opinion or expertise. And if you keep in mind both of those things, I think you'll actually be, if you will, not just a builder of culture, not just a bearer of culture, you'll actually be a propagator of culture as well. So thank you all for your time. Thank you. And let's give a warm round of applause to John as well. So please join me in giving him an electronic round of applause as well.
Nice to see you guys.
Yeah, over to you, Robin.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Huggy. Thank you, John. Thank you, Olivia, for this valuable conversation. Everyone in the audience, I know, but please let me echo that all your valuable questions and participation really make this time together so special. So thank you so much. If you enjoyed the conversation, you're interested in learning more, you should check out our new course, XINE 242, Building Company Culture, which is linked in your dashboard. And I want to remind you that today's session was recorded and a link will be made available to you within a week. So you can review it if you'd like and have it. Thank you, everyone. Signing off from California.
And stay safe, please. Thank you.